The smartest way to deal with toxic people is not to fight every battle, win every argument, or prove every point. It is to recognize who they are before they ever gain access to your emotions, your confidence, and your peace. That is where real power begins. Most people do not lose to toxic individuals during the argument. They lose long before the argument ever starts because they fail to recognize the warning signs hidden behind charm, manipulation, and false kindness. They miss the pattern early, and by the time the truth becomes obvious, the damage has already begun. But the moment you learn to see those patterns clearly, everything changes. You stop being an easy target. You stop handing your power away. You stop confusing someone's words with their character. And you start protecting your mind, your energy, and your future with intention. One of the biggest mistakes people make is assuming toxic people always reveal themselves immediately. They expect manipulation to look obvious. They imagine it will come through anger, insults, aggression, or open hostility. But human nature is rarely that simple. The most toxic individuals often understand something most people do not trust is easier to gain than control. That is why they rarely show you their worst side in the beginning. Instead, they create an image that makes you lower your guard. They may seem generous, supportive, confident, understanding, or deeply interested in your life. They may say exactly what you want to hear. They may make you feel seen, valued, and safe. And that is exactly why so many intelligent people get trapped. They judge people by first impressions instead of repeated behavior. They listen to promises instead of watching patterns. But as Robert Greene teaches again and again, actions reveal what words are designed to hide. Anyone can promise loyalty. Anyone can claim they want the best for you. Anyone can sound kind when kindness benefits them. But character is never measured in comfortable moments. Character is revealed through repeated choices over time, and toxic people, eventually, always expose themselves. They criticize more than they encourage. They create unnecessary drama, then somehow position themselves as the victim. They shift blame whenever they are confronted. They make you feel guilty for having healthy boundaries. They seem strangely energized by your weakness and strangely uncomfortable with your strength. They may applaud your success in public while quietly resenting it in private. At first, none of these behaviors seem devastating on their own. That is what makes them dangerous. One comment, one guilt trip, one act of disrespect, one subtle attempt to undermine your confidence. By themselves, they may seem small, but together they form a pattern. And when that pattern is ignored long enough, it slowly begins to weaken the way you see yourself. That is how manipulation starts. It rarely begins with something dramatic. It begins with small emotional compromises, a sarcastic comment disguised as a joke, your feelings dismissed and labeled as overreaction, a constant comparison to others disguised as motivation, boundaries crossed in ways that seem too small to confront, but painful enough to feel. And every time you excuse what should have been addressed, you quietly teach yourself that disrespect is something you are supposed to tolerate. Over time, what once felt unacceptable starts to feel normal, and that is when toxic influence becomes powerful. One of the most damaging effects of toxic people is not just what they do to your peace, but what they slowly do to your perception of yourself. Instead of questioning their behavior, you begin questioning your own. You start wondering if you are asking for too much. You start wondering if you are too sensitive, You start wondering if somehow the problem is you. That confusion is not accidental. Many toxic individuals survive by making other people doubt themselves. Because the moment a person stops trusting their own instincts, they become easier to control. They begin looking outward for reassurance. They second guess their feelings. They hesitate to act. And when someone no longer trusts their own judgment, manipulation becomes much easier. But powerful people do not surrender that kind of control. They understand that awareness is one of the strongest forms of self-defense. They do not rush to become emotionally attached. They observe. They pay attention. They watch how a person behaves when things do not go their way. They watch how they treat people who have nothing to offer them. They watch whether their actions remain consistent when no one is watching. Because genuine integrity does not change with convenience. Someone who repeatedly creates conflict, spreads negativity, avoids responsibility, or drains your emotional energy is telling you everything you need to know, not through opinions, not through excuses, through behavior. And that is an important distinction. There is a difference between a difficult person and a toxic person. Every human being has flaws. Everyone struggles. Everyone experiences stress, fear, disappointment, and failure. A difficult person may say the wrong thing, make mistakes, or have emotional limitations, but they are willing to reflect, apologize, and grow. A toxic person is different. A toxic person repeats destructive patterns while expecting everyone else to adjust around them. They avoid accountability because the pattern benefits them. They demand grace without offering change. Once you understand that difference, you stop wasting your energy trying to fix people who have no intention of changing. That does not mean becoming cold. It does not mean distrusting everyone. It does not mean living with suspicion in your heart. Life still requires trust, compassion, and meaningful connection, but wisdom requires balance. You can remain kind without becoming naive. You can remain compassionate without excusing repeated disrespect. You can give people opportunities without ignoring the truth their behavior keeps revealing. Protecting your peace is not selfish. It is self-respect. Every moment spent under the influence of a toxic person is a moment that could have been invested in becoming stronger, wiser, more focused, and more emotionally free. The truth is simply toxic people gain power only when you fail to recognize them early enough. The moment you stop judging people by their promises and start judging them by their patterns, your life begins to change. You make better decisions. You build healthier relationships. You protect your confidence before manipulation ever has the chance to take root. Awareness is not about fearing people. It is about refusing to ignore the evidence in front of you. And once you learn to recognize toxic people before they shape your thinking, the next step becomes essential learning how to control your emotions. Because no toxic person can dominate someone who refuses to surrender their inner peace. Recognizing toxic people is only the beginning. Awareness keeps you from walking blindly into manipulation, but awareness alone is not enough. The smartest way to deal with toxic people is to make sure they never gain control over your emotions. This is where many people lose their power. They correctly identify toxic behavior, but they still allow that behavior to control their mood, their decisions, and their peace of mind. The moment someone can consistently control how you feel, they hold influence over your life, whether you realize it or not. Real strength is not found in controlling toxic people. Real strength is found in refusing to let toxic people control you. Robert Greene often emphasizes that those who master themselves become far more difficult to manipulate than those who react to everything around them. Toxic people understand this principle even if they never say it out loud. They know the easiest person to influence is the one who reacts emotionally to every insult, every criticism, every rejection, every act of disrespect. That is why they provoke, sometimes with anger, sometimes with guilt, sometimes with silence, sometimes with passive aggression, sometimes with calculated indifference. The method may change, but the objective stays the same. They want your emotions to become predictable because predictable emotions are easier to control. Think about how easily one negative comment can dominate an entire day. You may hear 10 compliments and one criticism, yet your mind keeps returning to the criticism. Toxic people understand that. They know emotional discomfort captures attention more powerfully than emotional comfort. And because they understand this part of human nature, they create confusion, insecurity, and tension on purpose. They want your attention. They want your reaction. They want you focused on them instead of focused on your life. Before long, you are no longer concentrated on your goals, your purpose, your family, or your future. You are concentrated on managing someone else's chaos. That is the moment your emotional freedom begins to disappear. Many people think emotional control means suppressing feelings. It does not. Suppressed emotions do not disappear. They return later with more force. Emotional mastery begins with acknowledging what you feel without allowing what you feel to control what you do. You may feel hurt when someone disrespects you. You may feel angry when someone lies, manipulates, or spreads negativity. You may feel disappointed when someone you cared about reveals destructive patterns. Those emotions are natural. The mistake is not feeling them. The mistake is letting temporary emotions make permanent decisions. Emotion should sharpen your awareness, not command your behavior. One of the most common traps toxic people create is emotional guilt. They make you feel responsible for the damage they created. They twist conversations until you are apologizing for defending your own boundaries. They present themselves as victims the moment they are confronted with consequences. And if you are not emotionally disciplined, you may spend years carrying burdens that were never yours to carry. That is why learning to separate responsibility from manipulation is one of the smartest choices you can make. You are responsible for your behavior. You are responsible for your words. You are responsible for your choices. But you are not responsible for constantly fixing people who refuse to take responsibility for themselves. Another powerful lesson is learning to pause before reacting. Toxic people often expect immediate responses because emotional reactions reveal weakness. Every instant defense, every rushed argument, every attempt to explain yourself in the heat of the moment gives them access to your attention. But when you learn to pause, breathe, and think before responding, everything changes. A calm mind sees what an emotional mind misses. Instead of getting dragged into unnecessary conflict, you begin making decisions from clarity rather than impulse. Instead of saying what feels satisfying in the moment, you start doing what protects your peace in the long run. There is also tremendous power in understanding that not every opinion deserves your emotional investment. Some criticism is honest and helpful. Some people challenge you because they genuinely want to see you grow. Those words may be difficult to hear, but they come from respect. Toxic criticism is different. Its goal is not growth. Its goal is control. It does not sharpen your character. It attacks your confidence. It does not help you improve. It makes you doubt yourself. Emotionally mature people learn the difference. They accept useful criticism with humility, but they refuse to carry insults that serve no purpose beyond creating insecurity. They do not confuse cruelty with honesty. They do not confuse manipulation with concern. The strongest people are not the ones who never feel anger, disappointment, or frustration. They are the ones who refuse to let those emotions become permanent residents in their minds. They understand that resentment gives toxic people free space in their thoughts long after the conversation is over. Choosing peace does not mean pretending nothing happened. It means refusing to let someone else's darkness shape your future. Every minute spent replaying toxic conversations is a minute taken away from building the life you actually want. And when you develop that level of emotional discipline, something remarkable happens. Toxic people begin losing interest. Those who thrive on reactions often become frustrated when they realize they can no longer disturb your inner balance. They may continue their behavior, but it no longer produces the same effect because your emotional stability is no longer tied to their approval, their criticism, or their attention. That quiet self-control becomes your protection. It cannot be manipulated because it comes from within. Remember this: the smartest way to deal with toxic people is not to become as toxic as they are. It is to become so emotionally disciplined that their attempts to control your mood no longer succeed. When you master your reactions, you protect your confidence, preserve your peace, and keep your focus on the life you are building instead of the chaos they are creating. And once you learn to protect your emotions, the next step becomes essential: building boundaries. Because emotional strength becomes truly powerful only when it is supported by the courage to decide who deserves access to your life. Once you recognize toxic people and learn to control your emotional reactions, one lesson will determine whether your peace lasts or disappears. The smartest way to deal with toxic people is to establish boundaries that protect your time, your energy, and your self-respect. Many people misunderstand boundaries. They think boundaries are walls built to shut people out. But healthy boundaries are not designed to isolate you. They are designed to protect you from relationships that slowly destroy your confidence. Without boundaries, even the strongest mindset eventually becomes exhausted because constant exposure to toxic behavior drains emotional strength over time. One of the greatest misconceptions about kindness is the belief that being a good person means saying yes to everything. Many people are taught that sacrifice is always noble and that refusing someone is selfish. Toxic individuals recognize that mindset and they use it. They rely on guilt more than force. They expect you to keep adjusting, keep forgiving, keep being available, keep tolerating, no matter how they treat you. Over time, your kindness stops being appreciated and starts being expected. Your generosity becomes a doorway to exploitation. What began as compassion slowly turns into permission. Robert Greene often reminds us that power is connected to limits. People naturally test what is available to them. When no limits exist, many will continue taking more than they should. Sometimes it is not even because they are evil. Sometimes it is simply because human nature tends to move toward whatever is permitted. That is why boundaries matter. Boundaries teach people how they are allowed to treat you. Every time you protect your standards, you reinforce your self-respect. Every time you repeatedly ignore those standards, you communicate the opposite, and you send the message that your limits can be crossed without consequence. Think about someone who constantly interrupts your peace. They demand your attention when it benefits them, but disappear when you need support. They criticize your decisions, but become defensive when you question theirs. They expect unlimited patience while offering very little understanding in return. If you continue allowing this behavior without establishing clear limits, the situation usually does not improve. It gets worse because people often repeat what they believe they can get away with. The absence of boundaries invites repeated disrespect. One of the hardest parts of setting boundaries is accepting that not everyone will like them. Toxic people often become uncomfortable the moment you stop allowing behavior they once benefited from. They may accuse you of changing. They may say you have become selfish, distant, difficult, or cold. And that reaction confuses many people because they mistake resistance for proof they are doing something wrong. But often the opposite is true. When someone values you only when you abandon your own needs, they do not respect you. They respect the access they once had to your time, your energy, and your emotional labor. That is why boundaries require courage. It is easy to protect your standards when no one challenges them. The real test comes when saying no disappoints someone. Emotionally mature people understand that temporary discomfort is sometimes the price of long-term peace. They know that avoiding one difficult conversation today can create years of frustration tomorrow. They do not fear conflict as much as they fear losing themselves by constantly betraying their own values to keep others comfortable. Healthy boundaries are not loud. They are not dramatic. They do not require endless speeches. They are communicated clearly, respectfully, and consistently. Sometimes no is enough. Sometimes distance is enough. Sometimes refusing to engage is enough. The power of a boundary does not come from the volume of your voice. It comes from your willingness to enforce what you have decided. A boundary without consistency quickly becomes a suggestion, and toxic people are often the first to notice the difference. Another important truth is that boundaries protect not only your peace, but also the quality of your relationships. Healthy people usually respect honest limits because they understand that mutual respect strengthens connection. Toxic people react negatively because boundaries remove the control they once had. And that response tells you something important. It reveals who values you as a person and who only valued unrestricted access to your life. So stop fearing that boundaries will drive the wrong people away. Sometimes boundaries are exactly what reveal which relationships were never healthy to begin with. There is also a deeper psychological reward in protecting your limits. Every time you defend your boundaries, you strengthen your trust in yourself. You prove that your feelings matter. You prove that your time has value. You prove that your peace deserves protection. And that kind of quiet self-respect grows with every decision you make. Eventually, you stop wondering whether you are asking for too much. You start realizing that respect is not something you beg for. It is something you demonstrate by refusing to tolerate repeated disrespect. The smartest way to deal with toxic people is not to spend your life trying to change their behavior. It is to control what you allow into your life. Boundaries shift your focus away from controlling others and back toward taking responsibility for yourself. And that shift changes everything. You stop measuring your worth by how much pain you can endure. You start measuring it by how well you protect your values. And the result is not isolation, it is freedom. The freedom to invest your energy in people who genuinely respect your presence instead of constantly testing your limits. When your boundaries become stronger than your fear of disappointing others, toxic people lose one of their greatest weapons. They can no longer manipulate your kindness, consume your time, or quietly erode your confidence because you have made one life changing decision. Your peace is no longer negotiable. And once your boundaries are strong enough to protect your peace, the next lesson becomes clear. Silence and distance often accomplish far more than endless arguments ever will. Once you recognize toxic people, master your emotions, and establish strong boundaries, there is one final mistake many people still make. They believe they must defeat toxic people through confrontation, explanation, or constant debate. But the smartest way to deal with toxic people is often the opposite. And it is understanding that silence and distance can achieve what endless conflict never will. Not every battle deserves your attention. Not every person deserves access to your peace. Sometimes the greatest victory is refusing to play the game at all. One of the defining traits of toxic people is that they thrive on emotional reactions. They are not always looking for resolution. More often, they are looking for control. Every argument gives them another chance to twist your words. Every emotional response gives them another opportunity to provoke you. Every explanation creates one more opening for accusation. Before long, you realize you are no longer in a conversation. You are trapped in a cycle. And that is why silence is so powerful. Silence interrupts the pattern. It denies them the reaction they expected. It protects your energy from being wasted on conversations that were never meant to create understanding. Robert Greene often teaches that true power belongs to those who know when to act and when to remain still. Most people think strength must always be loud. They think confidence means having the last word, winning every debate, and proving everyone wrong. But truly disciplined people do not waste energy trying to convince those who are committed to misunderstanding them. They understand that some people do not misunderstand you by accident. They misunderstand you on purpose because misunderstanding gives them permission to continue the behavior they refuse to examine. In those moments, more words rarely produce more clarity. They only create more material for manipulation. Think about how much life people lose trying to defend themselves to toxic individuals. They replay conversations at night. They draft long messages in their minds. They search endlessly for the perfect sentence that will finally make the other person understand. But usually, the issue is not communication. The issue is unwillingness. A toxic person often hears you clearly. They simply ignore the parts that require accountability. Instead, they redirect the conversation back to you. Suddenly, you are defending yourself while they avoid responsibility. The conversation continues, but nothing changes. That is why silence should never be mistaken for weakness. Silence is not surrender. Silence is discipline. It is the refusal to explain yourself to people who have already decided they will not honor your truth. Anyone can react immediately when emotions are high. Very few people have the patience to remain calm, see clearly, and refuse unnecessary conflict. That kind of restraint protects your peace more effectively than any brilliant argument ever could. Distance carries the same power. Many people stay close to toxic individuals because they fear loneliness more than emotional exhaustion. They keep showing up in environments, friendships, and relationships that slowly damage their spirit because they hope things will eventually improve. But hope without evidence becomes a trap. Every day spent in unnecessary negativity begins shaping your thoughts, your habits, your confidence, and your emotional health. The people closest to you influence your life more than you realize. If someone consistently fills your world with chaos, criticism, manipulation, or emotional instability, creating distance is not cruelty. It is wisdom. One of the hardest lessons in life is accepting that not every relationship can be healed. Some people do not want peace because conflict gives them power. Some do not want solutions because blame protects their ego. Others continue destructive behavior because it has benefited them for years. The smartest way to deal with toxic people is not to make them different. It is to protect your own character while refusing to become like them. The moment you stop carrying the impossible burden of fixing everyone, a new freedom enters your life. Not because the world suddenly becomes easier, but because you stop wasting your strength on unwinnable battles. This does not mean avoiding every difficult conversation. Healthy relationships require honesty, communication, and accountability. When two people genuinely respect one another, even difficult conversations can create deeper trust. But wisdom lies in recognizing the difference between a relationship that seeks resolution and one that feeds on conflict. If someone repeatedly ignores your honesty, dismisses your boundaries, and twists every conversation into another opportunity for manipulation, arguing longer usually does not create a different outcome. At that point, your silence becomes a declaration: my peace is worth more than this battle. Distance also gives you something priceless: perspective. When you are constantly surrounded by toxic behavior, clarity becomes difficult. You slowly adapt to dysfunction until it starts to feel normal. But when you step back, you begin to see how much emotional energy you were spending on problems that were never yours. The chaos that once controlled your day begins to lose its power because you are no longer standing in the middle of it. Distance does not just separate you from toxic people, it reconnects you with yourself. The strongest people understand that every unnecessary argument steals time from their purpose. Every attempt to force toxic people to change delays their own growth. So instead of investing endless energy in people who refuse transformation, they invest that energy in becoming wiser, healthier, calmer, more disciplined, and more powerful. Their silence is not empty, it is full of purpose. Their distance is not avoidance, it is protection. They choose growth over conflict because they know their future deserves more of their attention than someone else's negativity ever will. Remember this: the smartest way to deal with toxic people is not to defeat them in conversation. It is to become so emotionally grounded that you no longer feel compelled to participate in battles that only drain your peace. When you master silence and choose distance where necessary, you stop feeding the chaos they depend on, and you start giving yourself the freedom you deserve. And once you understand the power of silence and distance, another truth becomes impossible to ignore. Trying to change toxic people is often the biggest mistake you can make. After learning to recognize toxic people, control your emotions, establish strong boundaries, and use silence wisely, one final illusion must be broken if you want lasting peace. The smartest way to deal with toxic people is to stop believing it is your responsibility to change them. This is painful because many people genuinely believe that enough love enough patience, enough sacrifice, enough understanding can transform someone who refuses to transform themselves. And while compassion is beautiful, compassion without wisdom becomes self-destruction. You cannot force growth onto someone who is committed to comfort over accountability. Many people stay trapped in toxic relationships because they fall in love with potential instead of reality. They remember the tenderness from the beginning, the promises, the apologies, the brief moments when everything seemed different. They convince themselves the person they care about is still hidden somewhere beneath the manipulation, dishonesty, and negativity. So they keep investing, they keep hoping, they keep waiting, they keep sacrificing. And while they are waiting for the other person to become who they promised to be, their own life slowly begins slipping away. Robert Greene often reminds us that people reveal their true nature through repeated behavior, not temporary emotion. Anyone can apologize after causing harm. Anyone can promise improvement when they fear consequences. Anyone can behave differently for a few days when they feel they are about to lose something valuable. But genuine change is measured by consistency. It is revealed in actions repeated over weeks, months, and years. Smart people do not judge others by who they say they will become. They observe who they repeatedly choose to be. One of the cruelest traps toxic people create is giving just enough hope to keep you emotionally invested. Just when you are ready to walk away, they become attentive. They apologize. They promise. They remind you of better times. For a moment, it feels like change is finally happening. Then the cycle returns. The criticism comes back. The manipulation returns. The disrespect quietly reappears. And once again, you find yourself standing in the same pain, asking how you ended up there. This cycle is exhausting because it ties your emotions to possibility instead of truth. Think about how much life can disappear while waiting for someone else to become the person they keep promising to be. Months become years. Confidence weakens. Opportunities pass. Dreams get delayed. Instead of building your future, you become consumed with repairing someone else's patterns. Without realizing it, your identity starts revolving around rescue instead of growth. And that is the real tragedy. Not only that they failed to change, but that you postponed your own becoming while waiting for them to become someone else. This does not mean people are incapable of change. Human beings can change in extraordinary ways when they accept responsibility and genuinely choose growth. But one truth must never be forgotten. Real change begins within. It cannot be forced by pressure, guilt, constant advice, or endless sacrifice. If someone refuses to acknowledge their behavior, every attempt to rescue them becomes another opportunity for them to avoid responsibility. In trying to carry their burden, you may be making it easier for them to remain exactly as they are. That is why it is so important to understand the difference between supporting someone and saving someone. Supporting someone means encouraging them while they actively do the work to change. Saving someone means doing the work they refuse to do themselves. One creates mutual effort, the other creates exhaustion. Toxic people often grow comfortable letting others carry responsibilities they never intend to accept. The more you rescue them, the less motivation they have to change because someone else continues paying the emotional price for their behavior. Powerful people understand that their energy is one of their most valuable resources. They protect it fiercely because they know every hour spent chasing impossible change is an hour taken away from purpose, healing, growth, and peace. So instead of asking, how do I make this person different? They begin asking, how do I become wiser because of this experience? That question changes everything. You stop living as a victim of someone else's choices and start becoming the architect of your own future. The energy once wasted on frustration begins flowing into discipline, healing, learning, purpose, and self-respect. There is also deep freedom in accepting reality as it is. Acceptance does not mean approval. It does not mean weakness. It does not mean you excuse what happened. It simply means you stop arguing with the truth. If someone's repeated behavior reveals manipulation, dishonesty, disrespect, or emotional abuse, believe the evidence in front of you. Stop waiting for imaginary versions of people who only exist in your hope. When you accept reality, your decisions become clearer because they are rooted in facts instead of wishes. And clarity protects your confidence. The smartest way to deal with toxic people is not to sacrifice yourself in an endless attempt to save them. It is to recognize that your true responsibility is to protect your character, your peace, and your future. You cannot control another person's willingness to grow, but you can control whether you continue allowing their choices to shape your life. Every moment you invest in becoming stronger is a moment no toxic person can steal from you. And once you stop trying to change toxic people, the final step is the most powerful of all, building a life so strong that their presence no longer has the power to influence your direction. Everything leads here: recognizing toxic people, mastering your emotions, protecting your boundaries, choosing silence, creating distance, accepting reality, releasing the need to change others. These are not the destination, they are preparation. The highest victory comes when you build a life so grounded, so disciplined, and so purposeful that toxic people lose the ability to control your thoughts, your decisions, and your future. That is real freedom. The highest level of personal power is not making toxic people regret losing you. It is reaching a point where their approval, their criticism, and even their presence no longer determine how you live. Many people think the goal is simply to escape toxic people, but that is only the first part of the journey. You can walk away physically and still carry the emotional weight for years. You can create distance and still remain mentally trapped by resentment, fear, self-doubt, or the need to prove yourself. That is why true freedom begins within. It begins when your confidence is no longer borrowed from the opinions of others, but built through your own discipline, your own values, your own habits, and your own purpose. When your identity is rooted in who you are rather than in how others treat you, toxic people lose their greatest source of influence. Robert Greene often reminds us that those who master themselves become difficult to manipulate. A person addicted to praise can be controlled by praise. A person terrified of criticism can be controlled by criticism. A person desperate to be liked becomes a prisoner of other people's opinions. But someone who has built self-respect through consistent action becomes emotionally independent. They no longer chase acceptance because they have already accepted themselves. That kind of confidence is quiet, but it is powerful. It cannot be faked because it is built through discipline, not performance. Think about the people you admire most. They are rarely the loudest in the room. They do not spend their lives convincing others of their worth. They move with a calm certainty because they know exactly who they are. They protect their time. They guard their peace. They focus on meaningful work instead of meaningless conflict. Their energy is invested in building something valuable, not in reacting to every negative person they encounter. That is why they are so difficult to manipulate. Their life is anchored in something greater than temporary drama. One of the biggest mistakes people make after leaving toxic environments is allowing those experiences to define their identity. They begin introducing themselves through their pain instead of their potential. Every conversation leads back to what happened to them. Every new relationship is filtered through old wounds. And while healing requires honesty, healing also requires movement. You cannot build a stronger future while staying emotionally trapped inside your past. The smartest way to deal with toxic people is to refuse to let them become the authors of your story. They may have been a chapter, but they must never become the entire book. This is why personal growth becomes your greatest protection. Every skill you develop strengthens your confidence. Every healthy habit strengthens your discipline. Every book you read expands your mind. Every challenge you overcome reminds you of your capacity. Every act of self-respect moves you further away from the people who tried to diminish you. Slowly, your attention shifts. You stop obsessing over who hurt you. You start focusing on who you are becoming. And that is where lasting confidence is born, not from revenge, not from proving people wrong, but from progress. There is also tremendous power in choosing your environment wisely. Toxic people often live inside negativity because negativity confirms the way they see the world. Powerful people do the opposite. They seek relationships built on honesty, accountability, encouragement, and mutual respect. They surround themselves with those who challenge them to grow instead of pulling them backward. Because your environment quietly shapes your habits, your mindset, and your future. Choosing better influences is not arrogance. It is wisdom. It is the decision to protect the direction of your life. Another important lesson is learning to value peace instead of constantly mistaking chaos for passion. Toxic relationships often create emotional highs and lows so intense that they become addictive. Conflict is followed by temporary reconciliation, and dysfunction is mistaken for depth. So, when life finally becomes healthy, peace can feel unfamiliar. But peace is not emptiness. Peace is not boredom. Peace is not weakness. Peace is stability. Peace is clarity. Peace is strength. It is the foundation on which confidence, purpose, success, and meaningful relationships are built. The strongest people are not addicted to emotional chaos. They are committed to emotional balance. And as that balance grows, something remarkable begins to happen. The people who once had the power to wound you begin losing their influence. Their opinions become background noise instead of life-altering events. Their criticism no longer crushes your confidence because your confidence is now built on your actions. Their approval becomes irrelevant because you have learned to measure your worth by your values instead of someone else's validation. That is the moment toxic people truly lose their power, not because they changed, because you did. So remember this with absolute clarity. The smartest way to deal with toxic people is not by becoming colder, more bitter, or more ruthless than they are. It is by becoming wiser, stronger, calmer, and more grounded than you were yesterday. Every lesson leads here. Recognize manipulation. Master your emotions. Protect your boundaries. Use silence wisely. Create distance when necessary. Accept reality. Stop trying to change people who refuse growth. And invest fully in becoming the strongest version of yourself, because a life built on purpose leaves very little room for people who thrive on negativity. So never measure your success by how many toxic people you defeated. Measure it by how peacefully you live, how firmly you stand, how clearly you think, and how faithfully you continue becoming the person you were always capable of becoming. That is real victory, a victory built from within, a victory no manipulation can steal, a victory no toxic person can take away. Because when your life is rooted in self-respect, clarity, discipline, and peace, their power ends where your growth begins.